Welcome back. You know, we only intended to do these weekly looks at President Trump until his new administration settled in and things got into a predictable rhythm of sorts, and that hasn't exactly happened yet. Michael Flynn was National Security Advisor for only 23 days before he was fired, and now he is asking for a grant of immunity. Trump tweeting out today, quote, Mike Flynn should ask for immunity, and that is a witch hunt excuse for a big election loss by media and Dems of historic proportions, unquote. Flynn was fired after it was disclosed he misled the vice president about conversations he had with the Russian ambassador. The House investigation into the alleged connections between the Trump campaign and Russian intelligence has ground to a bizarre standstill while the Senate probe is revving up. And joining us for more on the investigation and everything else in Washington is the vice chairman of the Republican Party of Sarasota County, Jack Brill, chairwoman of the Manatee County Democratic Party, Cheryl Wilson, and presidential election historian, Mark Weston. Thank you all for joining us today. And Jack, I want to start with you because I want to get your take in terms of how are things going right now, because there seems to be a disconnect between what you see on the national news and what a lot of Republicans feel that they like what they're seeing from this president and his administration.
The base is seeing a lot of activity going on, seeing a lot of initiatives happening. Obviously healthcare was last week, now we're into tax reform, so they're moving along on a number of fronts. The national media obviously is Russia, 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 so there is a disconnect between what the base is looking at.
But even when you're looking at the legislative process, yes, health reform was last week and there was no vote. And when you talk about, tax reform, a lot of that was dependent upon savings from repealing Obamacare. We could get into that more a little bit later, but is there some anxiety that when it comes to actually legislating, it's not going the way that you had hoped?
Well, there's one of the dynamics of the House now is you've got the Freedom Caucus, which has about 30 members, and you have the Tuesday Morning Group, which is a group of legislators that meet on Tuesday mornings on issues. That's why it's the Tuesday morning. And if you start giving into the Freedom Caucus, the Tuesday Morning Group walks away, and they're more moderate, and then you go back and forth. So there's a real, the balancing act. Not only do you have to get it, through the House, the Senate, and the President's signature, you've got it's almost its own, three groups within the House. So
Cheryl, I would imagine that Democrats are sitting back and just watching the circus, so to speak. But we had David Jolly, the former Republican congressman from Pinellas, on last week, who said that Democrats need to do more. They not only have to, oppose the repeal of Obamacare, but they have to come up with fixes for what's wrong with it. I mean, so what are you hearing from your members and Democrats in Manatee?
We're watching what's going on. There's no doubt about that we're watching it and taking. In normal times would take some political satisfaction in it. But what's going on has become so serious and so dangerous for the country that we're definitely not enjoying what's happening with the Russia situation. We're glad, though, to talk about health care. We're glad to talk about health reform or about tax reform and about the connection between the two. We certainly have options on Obamacare. We certainly have things that we would propose. We would start right here in Florida and say, let's continue Medicaid expansion. Let's relook at Medicaid expansion. And you'll hear Democrats saying that all over the country in states that have not embraced the Medicaid expansion. So what we are struggling with is which are the issues that we're going to deal with at any particular time. We could choose a different one each day and bring it to the forefront in the consciousness of the voters. And we're hearing from a lot of those people.
Mark, a lot of new presidential administrations get off to a bumpy start. Some things predictably will not go along the way you would want them to go along. But looking at past administrations, how would you rank these first 60-something days in office?
Well, there are two ways to rank it. A lot of presidents like Franklin Roosevelt and Barack Obama had terrible economies, really terrible economies that they had to deal with in the first months of their administration. But in terms of administrative competence, we're not seeing good signs. The Gallup poll shows that Trump's support is down to 36%, which means about 1 out of 5 Republicans who voted for Trump are not happy with him. And diplomacy is so much a part of politics, and yet Trump is going after the Freedom Caucus and saying we're going to people against you in the primary in 2018. And to get a majority, you either need people in the Freedom Caucus or you need the Democrats, one or the other, and he's blasting both of them.
Right. We will pick up on that more in a moment. Our discussion continues after we check the weather, so stay with us. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we are discussing the congressional investigations into Russian interference in the election, the week in Washington, and the impact. All here on the Suncoast. Our guests tonight are the Vice Chairman of the Republican Party of Sarasota County, Jack Brill, the Chairwoman of the Manatee County Democratic Party, Cheryl Wilson, and presidential elections historian, Mark Weston. Let's talk a little bit more about Russia, because Jack, you know, when I talk to other folks around town, what I often hear is most Republicans don't care about the issue involving Russia. Is that fair to say?
Most people don't. I will add on that the Russian press secretary this morning said that the conditions with the U.S. were worse than the Cold War, which is something we should be taking notice with currently. But, you know, a lot of what's going on up on the Hill may be doing more to damage relations with Russia on the long term, so that, who knows?
Former Vice President Dick Cheney said earlier this week in some quarters that would be considered an act of war. So he takes it seriously.
I listened to that and I took it very seriously, and they went on to comment that Putin is trying to meet with Trump to have a normal, and Trump won't meet with him, which is probably a good thing right now. Obviously the social bloggers in that part of the world probably did a lot of stuff during the election, but it wasn't anything that was sanctioned or illegal. But who knows at this point?
So Cheryl and Mark, I want to get your take, because Democrats take it very seriously. They blame what happened with Russia in terms of all the news that came out, the Podesta emails, as one of the reasons why Hillary Clinton lost, because the emails and the constant drip was embarrassing. How do you explain the divide between how Democrats and Republicans look at this?
I wouldn't try to explain that, because I believe that Democrats take it seriously, and I believe that Americans need to take it seriously. This is an issue that's beyond politics. This is a security issue. This is an issue of our sovereignty. And I am frankly amazed that anyone wouldn't take it seriously. If you look at the Russian pattern in Eastern Europe, they certainly interrupted and interfered in elections there. If you look at mainland Europe, Western Europe, they certainly had their position in the Brexit vote. They're certainly front and center in the French elections that are going on right now. Why would they not have been trying to interfere in the American election?
Mark, is this simply the nature of our politics at this stage?
No, this is a very serious allegation. We don't yet know how deep, or if any, there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. But two things that I would like to know: there were many meetings between Trump officials, Trump campaign officials, and high-level Russians. Not just one or two, but many meetings. Why? And the other thing is, Roger Stone, one day in advance, put out on an email saying, watch out for the next WikiLeaks dump tomorrow. How did he know that there was going to be a big dump on Hillary Clinton?
Roger Stone just did an interview this week that said he didn't know anything. He was speculating.
Well,
so
that's quite a speculation.
And it is very serious, and Republicans take it very seriously too. But why not let the investigations, Senate, House, FBI, let them go through the process before making judgments?
If we had faith that they would.
Let me ask you, what is more important? Getting to the bottom of whether or not the Russians interfered and that there was coordination with the Trump campaign, or investigating who's leaking this?
Both.
Yeah.
Both.
Mm-hmm. Both.
Okay. Let's move on, and let's talk about legislation. If you look at the president's job approval polls that come out, and of course, the president thinks that most of the polls are fake news anyway, but they're in the high 30s, low 40s, and what's not helping is that he campaigned on the promise to immediately repeal and replace Obamacare. You're not going to get Democratic votes to do that, but the president did not get enough Republican votes to do that, and now we are in kind of a never land, because it's very hard to move on with tax reform unless you have the monies that were going to be saved from repealing Obamacare.
that's another reason we need to be paying attention to this president's agenda. And I don't use the word agenda from a political standpoint. There is no plan. There is no process in line. We were going to repeal and replace Obamacare. That didn't work. It's over. Now it's back. Tax reform was going to be next. Tax reform had to take a second seat. There is no process. There is no plan. There is no experience. There is no government going on.
And respectfully, though, we don't know what the plan is or the agenda is. You know, so I think there is definitely a plan. There is an agenda, but we're not, you and I aren't going to know it.
Well, we know what he ran on. We know what he said when he ran.
But you also are still within the first 100 days. You know, when you're talking about something as large as healthcare, you know, it should take 6 months or 9 months. Tax reform should take 6 months or 9 months.
I remember the story.
Why was it rushed through so much?
I wasn't there.
I remember the story when Barack Obama took office, and we were in the worst recession since the Depression, and jobs were disappearing, and his team was telling him, take one at a time, take one issue at a time, and he said, no, we have to deal with all of these.
And Mark, let me ask you this, because it seems that the president has a problem with the Freedom Caucus that really, were so difficult to deal with during this negotiation, and by seceding to some of their demands, he lost moderate Republicans. So he is finding what John Boehner found when he was Speaker of the House. It is very, very difficult to navigate the Republican-controlled House, even if you're a Republican president.
There's no question the Republican Party is not a unified party. If I were President Trump, I would go after infrastructure. That is one issue that the Democrats would love to join in on, and I think he could get infrastructure legislation fairly quickly. And if he doesn't get some legislation fairly quickly, his approval ratings may go down to 28, 29%. If they do, you'll see less and less cooperation on the Hill.
Wouldn't it have been smarter to go after something like infrastructure first, which has bipartisan support and might have been an early big win?
Well, I think you also have to look at who's paying for it. You know, we obviously, you go back, you look at Social Security is $1 trillion. You got a $3.6 trillion budget. Social Security is $1 trillion. The health care is $1 trillion. Then you've got the military and everything, all the rest. That's the reason we have deficits, and we cannot continue to have these deficits to pay for these things. And we know that the health care costs, Medicare and Medicaid, are almost $100 trillion underfunded
and what's
in the
that
next 30 years.
What's that military budget? What's that number?
$700 billion.
I do want to get into at least one more area, and that's the Supreme Court nominee, Neil Gorsuch, because it now looks late today. Senator McCaskill from Missouri said that she is going to vote no on Gorsuch. So we're heading to a filibuster by the Democrats. Republicans who may not have liked Donald Trump during the primary or during the campaign always look to that Supreme Court pick as the most important reason to elect a Republican president. But now, where are we going to be if we get to a filibuster and the Senate has to have the nuclear option to get Gorsuch on to the bench?
But at the same time, remember who started the nuclear option? Harry Reid. So it's now what was good for one is now good for the other.
They had not approved any appellate judges. It had just gone on way too long. They had to do the nuclear option, and it was nice of the Democrats to leave the Supreme Court out of that nuclear option. But I personally think it's too early to force the Republicans into using the nuclear option. I'm not a fan of Judge Gorsuch. He apparently was in tears when he learned about Scalia's death, which scares me personally. But
that's another reason to have admiration for the guy, plus his record.
But the thing is, if we have the nuclear option now, that means the Republicans can pass everything without a filibuster for the next 2 years.
Right, and we have less than a minute. But what many Democrats are putting pressure on their senators is they believe that this is a stolen seat. That was stolen.
It absolutely is a stolen seat.
But if you look at the past history in the last year of every administration for the last several administrations, there was never a Supreme Court pick that got through in any of those administrations,
We're
Republican or
wondering
Democrat.
Somewhere.
Yeah. We're wondering if there's going to be in the last year of a Trump administration as well.
Well, but I will say, Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch will be our next Supreme Court justice.
Let's take a quick break, and when we return, we'll have final thoughts from our guests. So stay with us. Welcome back. Getting back into the investigations into Russian interference in the election, surveillance, the leaks, and oh, by the way, the former National Security Advisor's plea for immunity. Our guests join us right now for final thoughts. Mark, I'll start with you. Sum up where we are and where you think that we are going in terms of this young administration, and it is still very young.
Extremely young. We are 3/4 of the way through the first 100 days, and there haven't been signs that they're hitting the ground running. A lot can happen. There can be foreign crises that will change everything, so it's just too soon, really. But to go after the Freedom Caucus and the Democrats at the same time, at some point, President Trump needs to learn diplomacy. It's alien to his nature, but he needs to learn it.
And Cheryl, I'm going to skip you just for a second to get a reaction from Jack, because Jack, how do you navigate what Mark is talking about?
Well, we got to go back that, President Trump was not a politician. He's a business person, and that's what he knows, and that's always, he has an agenda to get things done, and, he doesn't want to do it one at a time. He wants to work on several things. So diplomacy is a wonderful thing. It's good, it's needed, but, this administration is doing it very differently, and that's what they were elected to do.
But at some point, Republicans are going to want to see results.
Absolutely. We're looking forward to tax reform coming up next.
Cheryl?
A businessman represents his business, and he represents his shareholders. A leader of a country such as the United States represents all the people. I think if anything, we have put to rest this idea that the country can be run like a business. We're not a business. We are a government of the people. And this president has not figured out yet that conservative doesn't necessarily stand alone. He needs to find some character. He needs to find some courage. He needs to find a conscience. He needs to find some credibility. He hasn't done that.
But at the same time, we're still very young in this administration. We got to give a chance. Let things, work through a little bit.
We have less than a minute, but Mark, I saw it written in one of the national blogs today that this president is off to the worst start in any president in modern history.
I think in terms of approval ratings, that's true. And I don't think he realizes the danger. If it falls down to 29, 28%, he won't even have the support of Republicans.
Jack, quickly, are you concerned about that in and of itself?
Not yet.
Okay. We'll leave it right there. FYI, want to watch past Roundtable discussions? They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. We want to thank our guests for being here tonight. Jack Brill is the Vice Chairman of the Republican Party of Sarasota County. Cheryl Wilson is the Chairwoman of the Manatee County Democratic Party. And Mark Weston is a presidential election historian.